thank you, my friends, for being here. I'm Kori Schake. I have the great good fortune to lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team here at the American Enterprise Institute. And we are delighted today to have two distinguished scholars, a distinguished policy activist and ambassador, and two members of the House Intelligence Committee gracing AEI's house to talk about Africa. So, Katie Zimmerman is a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, educated at Yale and King's College, is an expert on counterterrorism and the Sahel. Ambassador Peter Pham has been the special envoy to the Sahel, special envoy to the Great Lakes region of Africa, educated at the University of Chicago and Gregorian University. Congressman Austin Scott represents the 8th District of Georgia. He's in his 7th term in Congress. He is on the Armed Services Committee, on the Intel Committee, and he has demanded the right to introduce his colleague. So over to you, Congressman Scott.
Right now, but it'll all be good because it's on video. Jimmy and I have been good friends since he got to Congress, serve on the same committees, have a lot of the same issues that are important to our districts and the people we represent, whether it be national security or agriculture. And so Jimmy and I have, over the last several years, traveled to Africa almost on an annual basis, probably 15 countries or so. This last year, we were in Ghana, Senegal, Togo, and Morocco. And one of the things I'll tell you, he's just he's a great person. He's extremely intelligent. And the thing that I do think you need to know as Americans is that when we're overseas, if we have a difference of agreement on something, we will never let the people see that inside our discussions. It's always important that they see a united America. And so my great friend Jimmy Panetta and I, we enjoy our trips to Africa on behalf of the United States.
So before letting you actually say anything, Congressman Panetta, let me lob a big softball question and ask you and Congressman Scott what the most important things you learned on this most recent trip.
Well, first of all, Kori, thank you for this opportunity, and thanks to AEI, as always, for holding these very informative sessions amongst a time where it could be real easy to kind of overlook the Sahel and Africa, considering everything that's going on in the world, especially where the topics that we're seeing up on Capitol Hill or Taiwan or Ukraine or the Gaza Strip. That's why I think it's great that there's so many people here, and it's wonderful that AEI is putting this on, so thank you very much. Look, Austin and our travel to the Sahel region has been obviously eye-opening for a number of reasons. The fact that we've been literally kind of span the Sahel, going from Senegal, literally every country, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, we've kind of hit them all, and then a couple others surrounding that, as you heard, has just kind of kept it on our forefront and reminding us how important it is. Look, Austin and I come from very different districts. He comes from the southern part of Georgia. I come from the central coast of California. He comes from a red district. I come from a blue district. But what he said is correct. We kind of come together on these issues because we've been able to travel and experience these issues. Now, obviously, we've seen a number of developments in the Sahel recently, ones that I believe that we should be very concerned with. So, Kori, to your question, I think the fact is that you realize what happens in Africa will not stay in Africa. What happens in Niger will not stay in Niger. And I think that is the message that we need to be sending, and we need to be very aware of, that not only is the threat of the violence going to extend to the potential to the littoral states that we were just at and what they're worried about, there clearly is a growing threat of the VEOs moving from the Middle East into Africa and using that as the fertile ground upon which they could launch another attack against the West.
Katie Zimmerman, is that what you see in your work on this?
It is. It's certainly an understudied area and a place where U.S. policy has been essentially on automatic for the past decade and a half. And Peter can, of course, speak to the tweaks in policy that we've made. But when we're looking at the challenges, the terrain is austere, the logistics are hard. There are social issues that most Americans can't even wrap their heads around. And the governments really have only governed areas within the capital and the immediate environs of the capital for decades, if not centuries, right? This is a place where governments have never been able to extend their full power to the borders, and it's in the peripheries, those border regions where these groups are thriving, they're exploiting conflict, generating conflict, and the ability of the local governments and the international community to respond is incredibly limited. And when we have, it's been on the security front, which hasn't actually addressed the underlying issues.
So I know it's a big element in your work, Katie, that our counterterrorism policy is over-militarized. We don't think enough about the governance pieces of it. Congressman Scott, did you get any of that kind of feedback in your conversations?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the number of coups that are occurring right now, I mean, one happened when Jimmy and I were over there just south of where we were. We were going to Burkina Faso a year ago, and one happened in Burkina Faso. We were going to Niger this year, actually, and one happened in Niger. Obviously, we have a tremendous presence in that country. It's disappointing to me that we missed any of the signs that there could have been, and so from the intelligence standpoint, we have to kind of backtrack from where we are and say, all right, what did we miss, and where should we have picked up that there was potential for this? And sometimes we still can't find it. It's like it just came up overnight, and
Ambassador Pham, what did we miss in the run-up to the coups? What should we have seen? Where, as somebody so attentive over a long period of time on these policies, what are we not looking for that we should be?
Well, I think, and thank you again, Kori, for having me, and for AI for putting this on, and really salute the work that Katie's done over the years. It's been wonderful to see how she's developed her, keeping track of these on a week-to-week basis. What we've missed along the way, perhaps broadly speaking, has been the pieces that the two congressmen, the governance piece. I repeatedly argued when I was special envoy for the Sahel that the counterterrorism program, the security means, opened a space geographically and politically, but it had to be filled with something. And without that governance piece, nothing was going to work. We needed that piece. And so in Niger, for example, the latest coup in the region, the security systems has worked. Before the coup, the level of violence Niger has had was at the lowest level since 2018. There were areas where Tonga, where unfortunately in 2018 we lost several special operations forces to an ambush. That area was being resettled by people who had been displaced. But what was happening while that was going on was there were other parts of the military in Niger who were being left behind by the new, more nimble forces. The old elites were no longer the elites. When our European friends were cracking down on migration, that destroyed local economies. So there were all sorts of things that on the governance piece, and that's ultimately the key, is governance. Without state legitimacy, I use that term frequently, and I'm glad to see it's picked up some steam. Without state legitimacy, governments that provide basic goods and services to people, nothing's going to work. Second point, very quickly, that we're missing is we also have to keep in mind that some of these coups are succeeding, not because people want military juntas, but because they've latched on to resentment, primarily against the French. And in Niger is a perfect example where the French forces have now been withdrawn, the French ambassador was expelled. I've been in regular contact with our new US ambassador. First, we didn't have an ambassador there for almost 2 years. Then when we finally got wonderful diplomat, Kathleen Fitzgibbon, experienced Africa hand and State Department got her there, they have not had one picket in front of the US Embassy there. There's been no push to get us out. So I think we need to differentiate.
But if I may, Kori, Mr. Ambassador, I mean, in Niger, it seemed, and this goes to your question, there are a number of, why we missed it is because it's not just one thing. There are a number of things, from governing, from security, from the lack of prosperity especially. And then when you talk about governing, what type of government are you talking about? And the corruption of that government and how you fix that is a big can of worms to unpack. But I believe that the reason for the coup, based on what I've saw and who we've talked to, was not necessarily the French. It was some personal vendettas within the Nigerian government, unfortunately, and they're using the French as a scapegoat subsequent to the coup. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why they've exploited those.
Exactly.
But those sentiments, whether justified or not, are very real, and we have to take those into account in our analysis.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, Ambassador Pham, you brought up the point about the discontinuity between military training that we do and security service support and the lack of support in other areas. And I've noticed that in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places. And Congressman Scott, I'd be interested in your judgment. I think the IMET program is a huge and positive American endeavor. What the problem that occurs is that we improve the security services, but not other elements of governance in the society. Is there any way to better balance that? Or how are you thinking about the imbalance of IMET that the State Department runs for security service training and other governance elements? Do we do too much IMED and in that way unbalance governance in countries in the Sahel?
Well, let me, what I would tell you is that when we are engaged in a mission over there that is a military training mission, and I've brought this up and Jimmy and I have had these discussions, we have these young men and we have them 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Many of them have a 3rd to a 4th grade education, and so we're going to have them for 6 months to 24 months. And all we're teaching them is how to fight. And whether it is a USAID mission or at the time I was saying it was probably would be a French, some type of French aid mission instead of USAID mission, to me the educational aspect of the training is just as important as the training, because otherwise you're just teaching somebody how to fight instead of how to go out there and earn a living for their families. And so I think we have to look at it from the human element of we want people who can provide the security, but we also want those people to be able to provide a job outside of the security element. And that's the thing I think we've missed over the course of time. I do want to just follow up on what the ambassador said. Don't underestimate the impact of the French being kicked out of the countries. If the Tonga mission, if it had not been for a French pilot that flew unarmed, we would have probably lost all of our people on that mission. Jimmy and I, along with Richard Hudson and Anthony Brown, delivered a dagger from the unit of those soldiers to that pilot as a thank you to him. And so I think that I think we have to make sure that we're taking care of all aspects of the person that we're bringing into our program.
That's an excellent point. Katie Zimmerman, what would you like to see U.S. government policy encompass to better balance the security service building, which is essential and we need to do, with other things that may help expand governance in countries on the African continent?
The top line asks, I think, are asks that are made across states that are fragile, which is going to be funding foreign assistance beyond our security assistance. And in Africa, it's dominated by public health, which is obviously a major good the United States provides to African people in general and the world, right? It's designed to prevent pandemics. But it means that the assistance that's going to some of these critical countries is fairly fixed. There's not an ability to shift it around and respond to events on the ground, to respond to the dynamic needs of the societies. And when you look at the percentages of the small amount of foreign assistance that's going to countries that are crucial, like Niger, before the coup, for example, it was maybe a quarter of the total that are civilian personnel could play with in terms of focusing on rule of law, on criminal prosecutions, on explaining how to track evidence so that you don't just round up the usual suspects and throw them into detention centers for 6 months and then their family joins the insurgency. Those are elements that I think we need to be fixing. It starts here in Washington, funding the State Department, but also I think fixing some of the elements within the State Department in order to make those funds effective. And it's really this catch-22, chicken and egg problem set, where we need to be more effective with our foreign assistance. We need to ensure that the money isn't just being spent here in headquarters. There's the infamous pilot program in Burkina Faso that was $13 million spent in Washington, D.C., and never actually saw the light of day in the intended country. But that's something that I think we need to be looking at. Broadly, though, it's outcompeting some of these groups. As Peter said, most of the people on the ground, they don't want to have Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or other violent actors dominating their communities. They just they see no choice to ensure their futures. And that's something that the United States should recognize, that we can open the aperture for what prosperity means for different communities with just a little bit of an ability to outcompete these groups that actually offer very little to communities.
Mm-hmm. So, Congressman Panetta, Congressman Scott raised the point about the French mission and how deleterious to American interests the French being bounced out of countries. Can you say a little bit more about what the French have accomplished? Because it's fashionable to talk about America's allies not doing enough in Ukraine, in Gaza, in everywhere in the world. But I think the French, in their missions in Mali and other places, actually did work we would have had to do otherwise. Does it look that way to you or different?
Well, they were our partners. Obviously, that we did a lot when it came to, we do a lot with the ISR. We find, we fix, and we then relied on them for the finishing. And so they were very important when it came to that element of those types of operations. However, Austin brings up an excellent point about the mirages that flew low over the attack that was happening in Tonga Tonga, where we lost 4 Green Berets there. And that's actually, just on a side note, quick digression, that's what got me interested in the Sahel, is when I heard about Tonga Tonga, which happened in 2017, I think, it amazed me that we had so many legislators that did not know we had special forces in Africa. And that, to me, I think would be very disappointed for the men and women who are on the ground there. And so that's why I kind of delved into it. But the question that I continue to ask our generals in AFRICOM and so forth is, what do we do when something like that happens now? Their answer, consistently, we rely on other forces for QRFs, for that type of assistance. Mm-hmm. And now with the French being removed, this is an issue. This is exactly to Austin's point. This is an issue. So sure, we can provide all the ISR we want, but then how are we going to make that actionable? What are we going to do now? Because clearly, our 127 ECHO programs only go so far. The 333 programs only go so far. You had the French there that actually were able to carry out that finishing. Those are the types of authorities that they had. We don't have it right now. So that's the question that we need to start to ask our military is, we can provide all the ISR we want. Who's going to actually do something with that intelligence?
And can I?
Go ahead.
If you want to talk about Mali.
Go.
I mean,
Talk
French
about whatever you
ISR
like.
picked up a mass killing carried out by Wagner. And Wagner then used social media to convince the people of Mali that the French did it, when the truth is that Wagner had done it. And the end result of that was the French got pushed out of the country. And so, I mean, Wagner, and more Wagner than China, but both of those, and it's Russia now, obviously, but they've used the internet very effectively, with a lot of lies and sometimes using history to get the French pushed out. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be detrimental for the continent.
And I think, look, I think when you talk about France, Kori, there's so much more that's related that we as Americans don't have to deal with. The history of colonization that is, and it creates the antipathy towards the French in that part of Africa is really been a burden for them. Because obviously with Operation Barkhane coming into Mali, doing what they did for a little bit, that kind of all went away based on the fact that they started to get the pushback from the Malians. You were seeing it kind of then transcend into the UN itself, that largest mission the UN ever had, MINUSMA, I think it was called, that we visited, we were able to visit. That's gone by the end of the year, if not already. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, but in what you're seeing is when they leave, when the French leave, when UN leaves, if America leaves, who fills that vacuum? And that goes to Austin's point. The Russians are already there. And it's not it's not Wagner anymore. It's the Russians now. I mean, that's now that Wagner's Prigozhin's gone, that title of Wagner's gone, it's going to be the Russians. And I think they know that. And the disinformation that Austin talked about is a key part of them filling that void, as we're seeing in Niger with the flags that are being thrown around now, the Russian flags that are being heralded through the streets.
So, Ambassador Pham, what can and should the U.S. do in a post-coup environment how do we affect things going on in the country? What should our policy be? What should we avoid doing once the destabilization of a coup is either imminent or ongoing?
Well, first, let me say, obviously, I do not justify or condone coups. However, we have to understand each one and the mechanics, as you said. What went on? Was it internal regime jealousies? Was it outside actors? What was going on? First. Secondly, a reaction to it properly is to call coups coups. There are, legislation's quite clear on security assistance, but that doesn't mean not engaging. There's a difference between not giving assistance and not engaging. Good example, when I was special envoy in August 2020, we had a coup in Mali. And in fact, out of the gate, and I got in trouble with legal for calling it a coup before they got to calling it a coup. But we did. We quickly called it for what it was. We preemptively froze all security assistance at the time, even though we hadn't made the determination, which is required. But we also understood what was leading up to it, the corruption, stolen elections. And so understanding that background, we also engaged with the, and as long as I was special envoy, we didn't have, in fact, Wagner was not on the scene. They had a few Russian flags flapping around, but I met monthly with the head of the junta, and we kept him on. I didn't have a successor, and so, and I still don't have a successor in that role. And then we've had embassies like Niger where, it took a while to nominate, and then the person got held, excellent candidate was held up. And finally, ironically, Ambassador Fitzgibbon in Niamey was confirmed unanimously by the Senate a day after the coup. Well, if she'd been there, maybe things would have been different. So engagement is important in the region. And I salute both of you and your colleagues for visiting these countries. These are not easy places to convince CODELs to go to, as you know, having been there. So I really applaud. So that engagement is important. But then after is seeking ways within, consonant with our values and with our laws, to continue the dialogue. The fact that Niger has not yet brought in Wagner, despite flag waving, and the fact that we have an ambassador on the ground who's hard-headed and going to, I think we can look for ways to navigate this constructively, consonant with our values, our interests as well.
It didn't, if I may, Kori, it didn't with Niger just enter into a military agreement with Russia last week, I thought it was. They canceled a couple of EU military arrangements that they had, and they welcomed the Russians into their capital at this point.
Right. But there's within divisions, and we've noticed this in other areas, even within the militaries, there are divisions. And I think we need to keep an eye, and that's why we have an eye on where they are, and we play to those. We strengthen those who are doing the right things and engage with them, and where necessary, as we've done in Mali, the administration has done, I suppose, sanction those who have gone the other way. And so that nuance, I think, is the key.
So we've talked about governance, we've talked about military, both tools for shaping and influencing those societies, but also for destabilizing them. My bet noir is that we talk too little about the economics of American influence in the world. And it looks like for the last decade or so, the Chinese have been on a tear in building economic influence in the countries of the African continent. What did you see on your trip there? Is there concern about Chinese investment, about what Chinese investment may entail politically or in other ways, Congressman Scott?
Yeah, we were in Togo, and the World Bank financed the port, and guess who owns it now? The Chinese have, I think, 50% interest in it, and so there's a lot of money that goes to support countries from the world, not just the United States, that the Chinese are very smart in how they weasel their way into an ownership of what was supposed to be not charity, but assistance to a country, and then the Chinese end up owning it. So I think the world, not just the United States, has got to do a better job of making sure that the assets that we put in to help them with their economy don't end up in the hands of an adversary. And one of the things that was said to me on this trip, and I asked one of the presidents of one of the countries we were in, from a governance standpoint, Africa is huge, and they seem to be doing a lot of things that are distancing themselves from the UN. And I asked one of the presidents why that was, and he said that as long as Russia and China had veto power on the UN Security Council, then there wouldn't be much assistance for Africa, because China and Russia both benefit from the instability on the continent. And it's pretty simple. I'm embarrassed that I hadn't thought about it until he said it like that. But look then at where the countries go to for the additional assistance. So you've got one president saying this, that Russia and China benefit from instability, and yet, we still have leadership of the countries willing to go partner with them. Mm-hmm. So we've got to have better leadership inside of Africa as well.
It does seem like there's a very strong correlation between Wagner Group military assistance with corrupt governance and authoritarian governance, and Chinese economic assistance correlating with poor governance and authoritarian governance. Congressman Panetta, anything? You have such. I would love to play poker against you because you have such
it's the Italian in me. I know.
Face.
Sorry, I'm trying. No, look,
You clearly have thoughts on this. What are they?
No. I mean, look, Austin brought up an excellent point, but some of the things that resonated with me is that they told us over and over, and I really don't think they were blowing smoke to U.S. Congress members, that they want American engagement. They want American engagement, but unfortunately, to your point, Kori, there wasn't that economic engagement, so who did they go to? They went to the Chinese, but now they're starting to realize the difficulties it can be in dealing with the Chinese. One, as Austin said, the debt financing mechanism of, offering to do it themselves and giving them the financing and then them not being able to pay it back, so then China owns it. But two, I'll never forget this. I think we were writing, it was in either in Mali or Niger, and we were talking with a government official, and he says, "Look, I know we go to China for some of our infrastructure products, but those products absolutely suck. They don't last. The quality of their work is horrible. We know American products last longer and their quality is good. That's one of the main reasons why we want U.S. infrastructure to be built here, because we know they care not just about themselves, like China. They care about us because you're doing long-lasting infrastructure. Therefore, that shows you care about our country," which I thought was really interesting. And it kind of says a lot about us and how we do things, but how the impression that it has on people when we do things right.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Pham.
And just to add to that, I think it's not just the quality of American products and infrastructure, it's the ecosystem that we bring with it in American business.
Right, exactly.
And the values. But we can't compete if we're not there. And that's the challenge. Very often, awards are made to Chinese firms because American companies aren't there. And I will take my hat off to the current administration for the development of strategic corridors. What's happening in Lobido, which is a port in Angola on the Atlantic coast, the President highlighted recently, we were visited by President João Lourenço, the U.S. is supporting through a variety of DFC and EXIM, the upgrading and building of a railway system through Angola into the DRC, into Zambia, which will not only be a corridor for transport, but one for communications, for food security, and gets access to high quality, potentially green metals that we need, critical minerals. So it's all of one piece, and just a little bit of catalytic investment on the part of the U.S. and leadership brings in the private sector, which will bear most of the burden for the financing, and it creates something that countries want. And exactly as Congressman Panetta just said, a lot of these countries want American technology. Full disclosure, I sit on the board of an American telecom that is the only one operating in Africa. And in Angola, one of the reasons the government wanted us in there, and we were not the low bid, we were not the high bid, excuse me, for the license, but they wanted someone who would build out a 5G system, which we did, without Chinese technology. And they were willing to forego the immediate payoff because it would cost us a lot more to do it because we don't have access to Chinese financing.
So, Professor Ambassador Pham, because you have a PhD, I always want to default to Dr. Pham, and then I don't want to be Germanic and be Ambassador Dr. Pham. But let me ask you one other question.
I've been called far worse things.
Why is it so hard to interest American businesses in the continent, in the 54 countries of the continent of Africa? Is it that we have an outdated perception? If you look at demography, if you look at potential for economic growth in the coming 20 years, why isn't there a bonanza? Is it just governance?
There's the combination thing. One, I think it's information. You're absolutely right. There's an outdated perception. Now, let's be honest. There is a heightened risk. One can't deny there are greater risks investing in Africa than, say, investing in my hometown of Peoria, Illinois. But that delta is probably exaggerated. So there is a risk exaggeration. But beyond that, there are some governance issues. There are other things, but not insurmountable. So I think information is key. But as Congressman Scott was saying, African leadership is also important. But also, I think leadership on our side. We benchmark, what our health programs do. We benchmark what our security assistance do. We also need to perhaps do more to benchmark what we do in our commercial diplomacy. There aren't even commercial counselors in most embassies in Africa. It's usually an econ counselor who doubles as the commercial counselor, and in some places also doubles as the political counselor. And no one person, however talented, can do all that simultaneously.
So one of the complaints that Africans often make is that we have a conversation about what Africans should want for themselves. What did you hear on your trip? I know you guys routinely go. What do you hear from Africans of what they want from American policy?
Well, one of the things I'll tell you from I think both of our standpoints is we realize that this is their continent or their country, depending on where we are, and that it has to be African-led solutions to what they see as their problem. And so we can influence things, but we have to be realistic about the capacity that we have with their population, the size of Africa. And I think one of the things that we have to do is seek out the leadership in that country that shares both our interests and our values. And those are the ones where you would invest more and probably have more U.S. industry going in and willing to create an economy that helps everybody, not just the leadership of the country. But I think we have to accept our capacity, and that if you don't have leadership in the country that's willing to work with you and shares both your interests and your values, then you're probably very limited on what you can do.
Congressman Panetta, what do you hear from Africans that you're talking to in your travels about where their priorities lie for when they do meet the standards of governance and leadership and have the alignment. What do you hear from them about priorities they would like to see in American policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, if they meet the standards, then that's a big question at first.
Yeah.
If they meet those standards, they definitely, obviously, by meeting those standards, I think security is a given. Therefore, they want the economic benefits of the relationship of having that with the United States of America. But Austin's spot on when we had a very interesting meeting with some in Ghana with the parliament there. Yeah, he's smiling. They had a lot to say about the United States and how they felt, not positively, to be honest with you, about the United States in sort of in similar to aspects of how people feel about France. Is kind of was their angle in basically kind of letting us know where we stand with them, which I thought was it was a pretty unfortunate meeting. That being said, they were sure enough to basically end that meeting with an ask of us to be there for them, even though African issues, they want African solutions. They want America to be a part of that solution.
Mm-hmm. Katie, let me ask you about China on the continent of Africa. Where do you see them active? Where do you have concerns about their activity, either in governance or in debt trap financing? What are you worried about the neglect of these relationships that the United States, for the most part, has going on that China's capitalizing on?
Kori, it's a great question, and I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about what I've heard both through my trips in Africa and also passed back to me by analysts who've been looking at this as well. And it echoes what the congressmen have put forward, but the big question that we get is, what does the United States want with us, right? Russia is very transactional. China is very transactional. The United States, Americans come in and they talk about democracy and these big ideas, but they don't actually say what they want us to do, other than don't do this, don't work with China, don't work with Russia, don't govern the way that you're governing, don't claim that you're a democracy and then have autocratic policies. And we haven't been able to really articulate, I believe, a positive vision for the U.S.-African relationship or even direct to various countries. And that, I think, is undergirding some of the failures that we have with our relationships. That leads into how China is engaging, right? It's very straightforward about what it wants. China wants to seize on the economic opportunities that it sees on the African continent, and it will do so by helping to lift economically some of the African states by bringing trade there. Doesn't always do it well, and of course it's setting up the system to benefit China more than whichever African nation is hosting it. But that's more than the United States is offering at all. And so when you're talking to these countries, right, even income that comes with a major debt burden, that comes with almost state capital capture, is better than the neglect that they feel from the United States. We put in cabinet officials and other high-level officials when we want something from the Africans. You can look at right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there was a full court press of Americans going through the continent. Compare that to Russian officials and Chinese officials who make regular stops on the continent to engage. And it's this sort of ask that we have that really sets it apart. Right, we have the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which I believe our colleague Derek Scissors has quipped, anything that's successful gets branded as Belt and Road, and other projects are forgotten about. But the Chinese are using that dual purpose. The various ports that they're developing have biometric screening, which is capturing data. They are also building them to military standards, even if they are not operating in the Atlantic, which allows them this possibility of expansion. And it's just a security threat for U.S. national interests to have this potential Chinese basing and realm of operations outside of their traditional theater inside of the Pacific.
Ambassador Pham, since you do telecoms work in Africa, on a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned should we be about China building out 5G networks, given that they got caught using it for espionage in the African Union headquarters?
Well, quick answer to your question, on a scale of 1 to 10, 12 maybe. Two quick anecdotes. When the African Union headquarters was first built, the then chief of staff there was a friend of mine. I went to see him, but he showed me around his office. Then to have a conversation, went out to a restaurant and sat in a restaurant to have our conversation. He knew what he knew what was going on. They've got the free building. That's what he wanted out of it, but he was going to have his meeting outside. Point one. Point two. When I was special envoy, well, on one occasion I was sent to a country to talk to its leadership about not allowing a Chinese military naval base. When I arrived, my control officer, and I'm identifying the country to avoid embarrassing anyone, the control officer hands me I couldn't stay at the ambassador's residence because the ambassador's residence was being renovated, and the ambassador was living in a small apartment, and so I went to a hotel. Gave me a personal Wi-Fi device so I could stay hooked up. Hands me the thing, and it's Huawei. I guess I won't be using this to do anything other than summoning the driver.
Right.
But to be fair, that was the only option in that country. Right. And so we should be. So with the exception of, again, I'm not making, but the exception of where there are secure technologies, and almost everywhere, it's not just Africans, it's our own diplomatic missions, our own military deployments, which then have to piggyback on systems for basic communications that are actually vulnerable. So I think we should be very, very concerned about it, and perhaps ask how it is that they're penetrating. And it's not just the existing infrastructure, it's setting the norms for the next technology.
Right. So one more question, Congressman. The most important indicator for a child's mortality rate, survival rate, and health is the educational level of mothers. Traditionally, this has been a concern in many developing countries, not just in Africa, everywhere. How do you see the role of women changing how do you see that driving change, or do you, in your conversations and in your travels, in particular in the Sahel?
I mean, when it comes to the military, not so much. When it comes to government, I think the example was the legislators we met in Ghana. Half of the people sitting around that table, and there was about 15 legislators, half of them were women. It was interesting to see the dynamics even within their little contingency when a woman would speak. So I think there's still some cultural issues that they have to get over. But like I said, knowing the fact that there were at least half of the Ghanaian legislators that we met with were women, I think says a lot about that. In regards to actually getting education on the ground, I think that's where our soft power can come into play, and focusing more on USAID and ensuring that the necessary assistance is there in order to bolster those types of programs. And one of the things about assistance, to a point that she made, when it comes to Niger, although our assistance is maybe a quarter compared to our military assistance, that quarter was half of Nigerians' budget. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was half of their budget. And I think that's a big issue as to why we're still in the country at this point. That's why we're not being blamed like France at this point, because of the large amounts of assistance that the junta that's now in power realizes they need in order to survive. So I think that helps as well.
One last question before I open it up to the audience, and that is, since both of you sit on the Agricultural Committee, are there opportunities for trade agreements with Africa in manufacturing and technology and agriculture? Are we missing opportunities for expanding trade between the U.S. and the countries in Africa? Congressman Scott.
Yeah, I think we are. I think the two key issues for Africa right now, the immediate issues, are Ukraine was 50 million metric tons of corn and wheat. That they were the largest supplier of the UN World Food Program. The port of Odessa functions at a fraction of what it could function with before Russia moved in. You've also got China, who is illegally harvesting fish in the exclusive economic zones around China. So you think about the population of China and their need for food and what is happening to them right now as we speak with the Chinese taking the fish from the sea. And I'm not talking about with rod and reels. I'm talking about literally harvesting machines, and then the potential disruption from Russia's war with Ukraine. They realize that they have to be able to produce more of their own food. The problem they don't have irrigation. I mean, they don't have the water supply that they need. And so unless the infrastructure is going to be there to help them with what it takes to actually grow the crop, then the importing tractors in the area is not a big economic opportunity. But it's one of those things, Kori, where I think our challenge is we don't really have a plan for like we had for Plan Colombia. So we've got a lot of good people over there doing a lot of good work. We've got missionaries, we've got Millennial Challenge, we've got State Department, we've got DOD, we've got other agencies, but there's no global plan for any of the individual countries. And I think that's where we've got to pick the countries that have, that share as close as possible our interests and our values and do everything we can in those countries with a plan to help them push forward.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Millennium Challenge program, because by linking governance to assistance, it helps countries move forward, and not just with aid, but with governance in ways that are so advantageous. Any questions from the audience or from our audience online? Yes, all the way in the back. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Femi Akibi. I'm a Nigerian. And as I'm sitting here, I did not see too many Africans, so I decided to speak for us. The African continent does not have any countries in it. We are colonial states. Guns, germs, and steel, we don't have any. The best thing the Western world could do for Africa, I've been advocating, is a Marshall Plan for our infrastructure. I'll stop so I won't take too much of the time.
Peter Pham, how about you respond to that?
Well, I think that a Marshall Plan presupposes a plan, and that includes identifying objectives, interests, values, and I think we are seeing elements of that. I call out and salute the Strategic Corridors initiative that is being driven by the Biden administration with the G7 to build strategic corridors that answer African needs, not only for energy, but also to do value added. That's one area where we actually have a very interesting mix with Africa. They have critical minerals we desperately need for our energy transition, for future technology. Cobalt. 2/3 of the world's cobalt is produced in one country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, yet none of it is processed there. Now, we've got all sorts of complications going to get to of doing processing here at home, but a lot of, at least initial processing, could be done with energy, done cleanly in Africa, and allowing Africans to capture the value added instead of shipping it. To me, the idea of doing something green by shipping ore 1,000 miles to Durban on a diesel truck and putting it on a boat and sending it to China is absurd as far as being green, and two, strategically puts us at a very a risk to our supply chains. So it's a win-win for the U.S. and for Africa to help Africa do value added.
So I might add one nerdy point about the Marshall Plan, which is where the Marshall Plan was successful in Europe, it was reconstructing industry that had been destroyed in the war. So you already had the industrial capacity. You were rebuilding transportation and industrial plant. And that is, I think, different from building from scratch and more challenging, figuring out what are the natural transportation corridors in a geography this big. All the way in the back.
Hi there, my name is Dominic Pinachoni. Thank you guys so much for talking. You guys made a really good point about African-led solutions. I guess I have one question is, what are American expectations now of the African Union, but also ECOWAS? Is ECOWAS, 3 military juntas now, is ECOWAS, is it where it needs to be? Is it, addressing proper solutions? Is it, did it falter in the response of, rapid military uprisings? What's the future for ECOWAS? How can America work with it to, really bolster up regional African problems and solve those issues? Thank you so much.
I think we always want, like I said, African-led solutions, and that starts with these regional partnerships that we've seen. Unfortunately, there's a number of these partnerships, especially when it comes to security there in the Sahel, and I'm really not sure what they've led to be frank. They keep on popping up with new ones, and I think part of that is credibility, and I think part of that is, what you mentioned in regards to the Nigerian president threatening military intervention and making them having that timeline and then not doing anything about it, unfortunately. Look, I think it's obviously we know the benefits of regional partnerships, but unfortunately you actually got to do something and not just talk, and actually do something. And I haven't seen much action out of them, to be frank.
Okay, Congressman Scott.
I was just going to say, we had this discussion when we were over there. The issue I think with any of those other organizations is credibility. And if ECOWAS is going to threaten to go in with the military, they better be prepared to go in with the military before they threaten it, because as soon as someone calls your bluff, if you don't do it, that's the end of the organization. So they do seem to have, the one thing that seems to be uniform is no more than 2 4-year terms for the president. And that seems to be the thing that, ECOWAS wants all of the countries to hold to. Ambassador
Pham, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think actually, Congressman hit it on that. Credibility is the key. In diplomacy, you never make a threat or a promise unless you're able and willing to carry it out. And I think ECOWAS, unfortunately, this has been making lots of threats over the last few years, and its inability to carry it out, it really has costed a great deal. And it's going to take time to rebuild that credibility.
Katie Zimmerman, you are no better a poker face than Congressman Panetta. What have you to add?
I'm not a politician, though. So I think that, as we're looking at what we should do, and this actually goes partially to the gentleman's point earlier, with our engagements with the African Union, with ECOWAS, with IGAD in East Africa, is recognize that these international organizations, regional organizations, are coming together and are quite nascent. They need some of the support that the international community can give them, recognizing, right, the AU is still partially funded by the international community. It's one of the few unions that actually can't support itself. But ECOWAS was an economic union. This is something that I think was missed in the American press during the time of the Niger coup. ECOWAS is to bring together an economic community. And you think about the European Union. Does the European Union have the capability to field a military force tomorrow to hold true on a threat? And the answer is probably no, through the EU, through NATO channels, certainly. And I think that's one of the challenges. The other quick point to make about kind of the vision for Africa is the U.S. has launched the Global Fragility Act, which Congress passed. It has the 10-year stabilization plans for certain regions. That is supposed to be an attempt at a roadmap to try out a different way for the United States to be engaging longer term with our partners, with locally driven solutions. So it's not quite the Marshall Plan, but it is an effort to try to change how we are working with these communities.
So we have more questions than we have time. We have only 3 more minutes, and I saw 2 hands that I'd like to take both together and let people make the last question on. First here and then there.
Thank you. Joe McAndrew, I'm with KRL International, and I just wanted to ask, we've talked about the role of ECOWAS and governments, but I guess outside of that, what do you see as the role of the private sector in Africa in, in advancing, U.S. commercial diplomacy on the continent?
Great question. Last one here.
Thank you. This is Paulo Mesa from Leonardo U.S. Corporation, and I would like to take the point and adding, when it comes to Africa and the West, we see the U.S., we see the State Department, DOD, the USAID, then we have France, other European countries, the EU itself, and then we have some multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, UN, WFP. But the idea is that we are so divided, so there is a lack, I think, of a common strategy. So now Italy will be the president of the next G7 summit. And so the idea of the country is to really highlight the importance of Africa. So what are your suggestions in order to have a more effective and united strategy? Thank you.
Great question. Anybody like to take a shot at it? I am going to give our two members of Congress the last word, with
I'll go back
apologies
to-
to Katie and to Peter.
I'll go back to what I said before. There needs to be a strategy for the country, and we as the United States and other countries as well need to be able to participate without leading. I mean, there are going to be opportunities for every country that wants to help to lead, but no country can lead in all aspects. The continent's too big. So there has to be a global plan. That plan has to start with leadership in the African country that shares the interests and the values of the people that are putting the plan together. And then if we can provide the best assistance in a certain area and another country can provide the best assistance in another area, then we have to be able to work together to do that. And that means we have to be able to participate without caring who gets the credit for the solution.
I think that's a great note to end on. Won't you join me in thanking these four terrific panelists?